I want to talk to you about the Bible's chain of custody. What prompts me to do this particular video is that I was recording some video shorts today. I do these what they call YouTube shorts. It just means it's got to be less than 60 seconds. And I did one on the chain of custody, and I must have had to redo it half a dozen times. Because I just kept getting cut off at the end. So I thought, well, maybe I should have one that I do longer on this subject. So I just gave a brief overview of basically laid out the fact that there is a chain of custody for the Bible. But then I thought I'd take a little bit more time. And these videos that I'm doing like this, right now I'm doing one a week, and I keep it under 15 minutes. So it might be 5, it might be 10, it might be almost 15. But I try to never go over a 15, just so people have. I'm trying to, make it something that's digestible for people. So, when I did the 1 minute one, I started with the Bible and went backwards to the Old Testament. For this one, I'm going to go the other direction. I'll start back at the beginning. So it's interesting that God did not have Adam write a Bible. Well, first of all, it's interesting that God chose not to write the Bible himself. He could have. He wrote the 10 Commandments. Moses carried up these stone tablets, and God put the words on them. So he could have done that, but he didn't do that. And he chose to have men write it. But he didn't choose Adam to write any books of the Bible. And he didn't choose Noah to do that. He didn't choose Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or even Joseph. He waits all the way down to the time of Moses to write it. And that's roughly 1500 BC. Adam was born, but he was created roughly, Adam and Eve were roughly created around 4,000 around the year 4000. I think 4004 was the specific date that goes back to the most commonly used dating system. Now, I know people will say, well, come on, you don't believe that, do you? You don't believe that the earth and everything was created in 6 days like it says in the Bible. Surely that was just myth. No, I don't believe it was myth. And I don't think evolution explains everything. Don't have time to go into all that right now. But it is absolutely clear that God created the heavens and the earth just as he said he did. And you can try to interpret those 6 days as 6 ages, but it just won't work. We don't have time to go into it now. I think I've written on it elsewhere. But, just have to accept that. So that's roughly 2,500 years from the time he created Adam and Eve and they sinned until the first scriptures were written, around 1500 by Moses. Well, in retrospect, it's easy to see why God waited that long, because remember, in Moses' time, he was the one who led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, and there were over 1 million men armed for battle. So if you count the women and children in, it's probably at least 2 or 3 million people that were part of the nation at the time. And they went in and conquered the promised land. Well, obviously, they were a nation. They had military might, and they could protect the scriptures, just like the United States of America could protect the Declaration of Independence and its Constitution. Now, had they lost the war, all those documents might have been lost, but they didn't lose. And we have those documents. In the same way, we have the founding documents of Israel, which are the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So that's the sort of basis that they started with. And one of the things that Moses said was that God would raise up a prophet for Israel. And over time, he did in the subsequent generations. So Joshua took over for him. Joshua wrote a book of the Bible. And And then after him, Samuel wrote, and then many, many others, Isaiah, Jeremiah, David the king. And various people wrote, and every time they wrote, they were kept by the nation, and specifically by the priest, the descendants of the tribe of Levi. There were 12 tribes to Israel. Levi's descendants were called the priest. They attended the temple. They managed all the holy furnishings of the temple, and they maintained the scriptures for Israel and made copies of them. Of course, everything back then had to be hand copied because there's no such thing as printing, and they wrote them on scrolls, sometimes called rolls, and the scriptures were preserved, and the nation knew who they were. Just like in the United States, if you go to Washington, D.C., they got the National Archives. I went there when my 7th grade history field trip. We went to Washington, D.C. in the summer for a week and went into the National Archives. I saw the Declaration of Independence there in that case. I guess they've still got it in a similar thing now. And the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And because the nation knows how to protect its founding or its sacred documents. And Israel did that. Now, when they were conquered by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in the 6th century, a lot of the higher classes of people were hauled off. They left the poor folks to tend the land, but they hauled off the best and brightest of the kingdom of Judah to serve in the halls of government of Babylon, and then later Persia. And so that's where people like Daniel lived, Esther, Mordecai, and others. So there were copies of the Bible. So they took some copies with them. There were copies that stayed in the Holy Land. And then later on, when men like Nehemiah, Ezra, and Nehemiah led Jews back from captivity, because the captivity God had decreed would only be 70 years, when people began coming back, then, some of them were bringing copies of the scriptures back, and there were scriptures that had never left there. And so you've got multiple copies starting to get around. But still, literacy rates were low, and these scriptures were expensive because you had to hand copy them, and you had to get the whatever material you were going to put them on, papyrus or whatever. And so not everybody could afford to have them. Literacy rates were probably inverse to what they are right now. So right now, let's say if literacy is 90% in the United States, probably 10% or less back then. So the main way people consumed written material was by going to the temple or to a local synagogue and hearing the scriptures read. That's where you'd go and hear, and that's how you knew what it said. So even though the literacy rates were low, it's not like only 10% of the people knew what the scriptures said. They all knew what it said because they all regularly took advantage of the opportunities to hear them being read. And that's how they knew the stories, that's how they knew the promises. And that's pretty much how the entire Old Testament was kept together. Well, then by the time Jesus came, and then he lives, he teaches, he's crucified, buried, he rises from the dead, ascends into heaven, and before he ascends into heaven, he sends his apostles into all the world to preach the gospel based on these Jewish scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, what's also called the Hebrew Bible. Well, Jews were spread all over the world at that time because not all of them came back, when Ezra and Nehemiah led Jews back, because some of the Jews had been exiled. The northern kingdom had been exiled before then. And there were Jews in every major city of the Roman Empire. So that meant there were synagogues, which meant there were scriptures in every city. So the apostles are going around preaching, and there's just copies of the scriptures everywhere. And they're just using those. Well, somebody will ask, well, where'd the New Testament come from? Well, what happened was the apostles couldn't be everywhere. They'd go into a city, they'd preach the gospel, they'd form a congregation, because they'd start off at the local Jewish synagogue, and typically some would believe, others wouldn't. And so if it was the majority that believed, it's probably the ones who wouldn't believe that went off and formed another synagogue. Or if it was the other way around, then it was the believers who would go off. And over time, the Jewish synagogues that didn't believe kept being called synagogues, and the Jewish synagogues that did believe were called churches. It was the same thing, people just began using the names differently. All church meant back then to those people was assembly anyway, or congregation. That's what the word meant. It certainly didn't mean a building, because most of these early Christians were meeting in homes or in a Jewish synagogue. The church buildings, that came much later in following centuries. So because the apostles couldn't stay in a city forever, they needed to move on to the next city. When they move on to the next city, they would sometimes write a letter back to the churches that they had already started. So Paul's the most notable for that. And there are 14 letters of his in the New Testament. And other apostles wrote, Peter, John, James, Jude, but Paul had more letters than anyone else because he just really had a more aggressive plan than any of the others. He was appointed after the original 12, a couple of years after Jesus was raised from the dead, probably. And he was a very active letter writer. The Gospels came about. We don't get as much explanation about exactly when they were written, but you get the sense that the apostles, when they saw the persecution they were under, knew their days were numbered, and so they felt like they had to get the story of Jesus down in writing. Now they expected Jesus to return in their lifetime, so there's that. They were figuring, how much do we need to write down if he's coming back? Well, that's a whole nother story. If you go to my website, you'll see explanations for how the second coming did take place, that it was a spiritual event. But to stick with the story of the chain of custody, the Old Testament, as I said, put together all the Old Testament and kept it in place because it was a nation strong enough to do that. Well, Israel was destroyed as a nation in 70 AD, so they lost the ability to be the controlling authority over those scriptures. And what happened is all these independent Christian churches, Christian congregations, believing congregations, they had their own copies. They kept the copies that they had and that they had made from the Jewish sources, and then they kept the apostles' letters and the Gospels, and then they would just copy them. Like if you found out that a church in another city got a letter, and you're visiting that city, you might get a copy of that letter, take it back to your church in your city, and over a period of several hundred years, all these, what we call the New Testament, there's 27 writings, they all got spread all around. And there were a lot of fake documents that people would say Paul wrote something that he really didn't write. They had to do a lot of work separating the genuine, the authentic from the forgeries. But they could compare notes with each other. All these congregations could get together, especially once it got to be the 4th century when Constantine, the Roman emperor, became a Christian himself. And that brought to an end persecution by the Roman government against Christians, which had been sporadic over the previous 3 centuries, but it could be pretty intense at times. But that stopped. And so by common consent, by consensus, it was understood these were the 27 documents. Now, that's when the New Testament, that's also the time when it was first possible to print a whole Bible, that you didn't have to use scrolls anymore, but actually could print them in something called a codex, which was just a predecessor to a book. It had leaves like a book does, and no longer on scrolls. So the New Testament and of course the rest of the Old Testament, they've all been in the same form that we've had them ever since the 4th century AD, just been passed on generation to generation. So that's the chain of custody. There's no reason not to trust the documents and not to trust that we know who wrote them. So let's believe them like we would any other trustworthy history.